Welcome to the third lecture in the series of the Grace Machine seminar. I'm saying the third lecture, but all the lectures are broken up in two. The introduction was broken up in two, a part on the gift, a part on the Grace Machine itself, and then the first of the figures, standing, was actually broken up in three parts, but that was because of the limitation of the recordings. But there was a part on realism and on the figure itself. So again, we'll be breaking up this lecture in many parts. Basically, again, in two parts. The first one, the gap, and then a sort of expose on the notion of the gap, how that relates to timing, how that relates to kairos, how that relates to sports again. So these will all return, and a third part maybe will be recording later. It is important with the gap to say, well, why do we? Because in the Grace Machine, the figure and the gap are immediately and directly related to each other. And that is mainly because this notion of the real or stance, or this figure of standing, is one of groundless standing. And that immediately relates the figure of standing to the four other figures, to floating, falling, hanging, and in this case jumping. So all these will give very specific aspects and perspective to the notion of standing. So there's always this double relationship. Also to say the notion of stance being groundless is very important. It's a very particular form of groundlessness. We related it to contrapposto, the figure hanging in itself, jumping in itself, floating in itself. Why the ground? Because the real as a thing cannot depend on other things, so there's no dependence. It's not hanging from, right? So in the notion of stance, it has to be groundless. Well, this is another groundlessness than the one of let's say romanticism, which people like Schelling with the Ungrund and the Urgrund, which is always this notion of the abyss, which led to this whole 19th century idea of the existential being ungrounded, and of course that led to existentialism in the 20th century, which is always a notion of the gap or the groundlessness that refers to the sublime and a certain fear and awe that is inherent to existence. Now, I'd fully acknowledge fear and awe. It's just that in our case, in the case of grace, the grape is much more measured, and it can be large and it can be small. You cannot find it at every level of existence, but it is one of joy, and not so much one of fear, and it's an extremely positive form of a void, which is very, very different from the romantic one. So what do we have for each lecture? I'll be starting with this double lecture with the horse on the left. We'll be returning to the horse pretty often, especially in this case. Actually a jumping and running horse, but in this case it stands, and it stands for this notion of the real existence as a standing forth, but also connecting it to jumping in this case. Why? Because as I said already, this notion of stance is not at all innocent and not at all easy to understand as a form of independence or mind independence, because it's always related to the other form of realism, which is that of mimesis, which is purely dependent or hanging from. So in this case, the horse is dependent on the ground, and that is quite literally in this case the ground. But it can also be the ground of causality, it can be the ground of reason. And our task is really to understand standing as rolled up in itself as something that refers to itself, while it is and while it is doing that, this form of standing or standing forth becomes a shining forth, and that's how it becomes a gift. Now, we know dolphins. I just want to introduce the idea. You will see a lot of animals. Somehow animals are very good in this this double notion of posture and motion, as Burke called it, for grace. And we know dolphins as they seem to be happily jumping next to the ship, or there's lots of movies of dolphins. I remember John Liddy actually almost like describing them as angels. There's an incredible kindness to dolphins. Yes, there is joy, and they seem to be extremely playful. And of course, the figure of jumping is directly related to play. I remember before people like Roger Corlois and before Johan Huizinga, who theorized play, we had Carl Gross, and Carl Gross wrote a lot on the expenditure of energy in play, and he referred a lot to jumping in children, jumping in the water, jumping from bridges, all kinds of jumping, obviously bungee jumping. But here there's, of course, the main figure is that of the dolphin. So we'll be showing the dolphin. But I'm wondering, I already described it, the jumping dolphin, as be careful to understand it as a just joyful play, because it is a form of serious play. And why is there this seriousness or this gravitas in the notion of play? Because they're mammals, and so they're swimming underwater. But they can't breathe, and they have to find a hole in the water to jump out, and then to breathe. But of course, they cannot stay in the air because they can't fly or walk or move otherwise. So there's a constant back and forth, and we'll be concentrating on this notion of, maybe it's too harsh to say non-fitting, but it is not. It's not fitness. It's not fitness, and it's a very subtle form of not fitting, and we know this very well. And it has to do with our daily suffering. How often you hit yourself, or you forget your keys, or you mislay a pen or your glasses, or bump into something, and there's this constant friction, and of course the examples I give is like almost like negative caps. But there is this dealing of things and creatures of having to deal with this not fitting, and of course that's what we call the gap in when we explained the structure of the grace machine in the introduction. So we'll be using the dolphin, and what I'm showing here on the left is actually the only time I found it in Michel Serres talking about grace. And let's keep in mind that Michel Serres is one of the few philosophers, maybe the only one of the last 50 to 100 years, who really makes an effort into figural thinking. Others have talked about figures, of course, Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes is another good example, maybe Donna Haraway as well, with Uncle Mouse, obviously, or the companion being like very strong figures. But Michel Serres sort of consistently uses figures as a form of philosophy. A figural way of thinking, especially in the sense of a figure that is operative, that acts, and is not an impersonation of a concept, but is itself constantly almost like traveling through an incredible variety of texts or images or articles our experiences. And we know the harlequin from Michel Serres, we know the parasite, we know, I remember him speaking about the Fosbury flop or the Thumbelina statues, obviously, which brings him very close to Roland Barthes. And now in this book, Genèse or Genesis in English, this is the only paragraph I found in Michel Serres on grace, and it's actually quite beautiful. The step is a step aside, thus is movement born, thus grace is born. Grace is nothing, it is nothing but stepping aside. La grâce n'est rien que céder le pas. Céder le pas is a form of stepping aside in English, but it's also a form of making way or a giving way, and that's sort of the title I give to this first part. This idea of giving way, because it's a beautiful idea that a dancer stands, and there we go again, it stands and then moves sideways. So again we get this our little obsession of the vertical and the horizontal. So this sideways movement is also a form of performance and appearing, right? So that's always our tropos. Our tropos is not just like, oh, there's a bunch of horizontal movements internally to the body, right? As in a contrapposto, and then it produces stance. No, it is a stepping sideways, a giving way. That is already a form of appearing, right? So it's not just a standing forth, it's also a shining forth. And what's so interesting is that this giving way, of course, relates directly to the gift, but it is also a form of, if you would like say céder le pas in German, you would say ausweichen or weichen. It's the same in Dutch, wijken. Weichen is obviously a form of weakening, of weichheit and yielding. So it's not just a giving, but it refers also to this weakening of stance. So that's a beautiful idea, because this weakening is now also the motor of movement, right? This internal weakening, this internal mobility becomes an external mobility of the body. And next to the idea of gift and weakening, it does create an opening, right? He's very clear. It's a step aside and make room, give up one's place. It's quite clearly the idea of an opening. So I think we can actually say from the dolphins, it's a constant stepping aside or finding openings. Obviously, there is repetition in the jumping of the dolphins, and it's the rhythm of breathing, obviously, but it's not a repetition of the same thing. It's a repetition that's constantly different. So each of these figures has to be created. Each figure has to find its own gap, and it's not just, we have to be very careful just to see it as a string or a rhythm of underwater and above the water. Now I'm going to refer again to sports. I've shown the image of Lionel Messi with his fabulous free kicks. But in this case, what is important is not just the illustration of the grace machine, but it is again this stepping aside. So we have to find a word or a set of words. Of course, I mentioned the gap already, but in football, I just call it football, we have the adversaries lining up to actually block the straight line to the goal. So there's and we call it a wall of players. They line up, and often when the shot, when the free kick is made, they jump up or they jump in different directions. but they're this architectural object, a wall. So what does Messi do? And it's not just a figure of his posture. It's actually that finding of the gap, which is not immediately part of space. It is something that is constructed. He has to find that gap. So I'm already saying that the gap is not the same as space. Of course, we use the word making space. It was synonym of making room or giving way, but it's not really correct. I'd say space is in all its neutral coordinates, in its Cartesian coordinates of extensive bodies. That is completely something else than this unfolding or this opening of a door or a window, and the finding of it, and the non-location of it, and the precise measure of it. Because there's this curved shot, because Messi cannot find a straight line to the goal, because a straight line doesn't fit, and he has to curve it around, and of course he fails every now and then. Of course, Messi is famous because he often succeeds. But there is something important here, is that there's this that the gap itself is something that is a gap in space. So it's not something that's there, and here we come again to our grace machine. It's a very complex diagram, and it's complex especially because the elements that make the figure are so precisely described. The field, which is on the right side, the sea, the plane of the sea, in the internalization of rhythm by habit or training or rehearsal, this whole notion of repetition, which is really the interior of the body. Then that's the notion of external space, that environment that's broken up in itself. So we are finding that gap in space. There's this field, and then the objects, and there's this gap between them. So we get these very particular, very precisely described elements that make the grace machine. And then there's this middle, this gap in the middle, which becomes very elusive, and you can never point it out. You cannot, like in any photo, diagram it and give it a color or point an arrow at it. In that gap happens the figure, and it's always this combination of stability and instability, or movement and posture. Posture is really the right word, because it fits between, let's say, the stability of form and rhythmic movement, and there's clearly the involvement of the limbs, according to Ravison. The law of the limbs are followed by the notion of grace. So in that grace machine, we always get this sort of arc. We get these and the calibration of an internal gap that has to be found either by animals or by us or by things, with an external gap. And in this case, that's illustrated by the dolphins. Obviously, the curved shot of Lionel Messi is of a horizontal nature, and in that sense happening in space. And then there's temporal notions of the gap, as we saw in Auerbach, between a metaphor or a promise made, or the first coming and the second coming in Christian realism. So there's a wide variety of gaps, and we have to find like a very, very different names for it. We'll play with the word chaos, which will literally means gap. Yawn, window, quarry, room will be a very important one. So we'll have a whole range of names for it, and they have to be applied to the very different situations. Now, a very important example of such a gap and its problematics, and how it actually calibrates in the finding of interior gaps with an external gap, we find in Xenophon in the memorabilia, an example used by Jerome Pollitt as well, and it's about Socrates meeting Pistias. Pistias is a blacksmith, and his expertise is in the making of breastplates. The thorax. Sure, you all know this, but the Greek foot soldier, especially the richer foot soldiers, the hoplites. The hoplites were wearing bronze thoraxes, so these have to be hammered and created very complex, obviously. We know them from the muscular shaping. You can see the upper muscles in the abdomen. That is a very famous image of the thorax. And Socrates asks Pistias, how do you make them fit? How do you find the right proportions? Right, so you're thinking like, okay, these are human proportions, so you can actually create a lot of thoraxes in advance. A cuirass, we would call it a cuirass. And then, what do you do when somebody is not has not the right proportions? When somebody's ill-proportioned, which can be all kinds of types of doesn't have to be like misshapenness, but clearly proportions differ. And how do you actually make that fit? And at what point is it a good fit? At what point is it well proportioned for an ill-proportioned body? And at the end, he comes to the conclusion that the body is not rigid, but now bent and now straight. And how can a tight breastplate fit? Well, it couldn't, says Pistias. So you mean that good fits are not the tight ones, but the ones that don't chafe the wearer? So that here we get at a notion of a gap that's really interesting, because a good fit is not a tight one. Because if you have an ill-proportioned body, or even a well-proportioned body, you'd never be able to make the thorax tight, because there wouldn't be any room for movement, because it would chafe the wearer. So that the idea of the breastplate is that it has to be a loose fit, and that it leaves gaps, gaps for movement. So somehow the internal structure of a hoplite is made up of its body and its armor of little gaps that allow for movement internally, that then are expressed or extended by external movement, the movement of the sword or the spear or the shield, all on the battlefield with very complex twists and turns and advances. But it's clear that within the thorax, and it's really interesting that it's about a thorax here, and that it's made up of bronze, because it's almost this notion of the sculpture, of the Greek sculpture, and with an ideal body, and then suddenly there's this notion of the contrapposto in there, this notion of movement within that proportional system, which are then expressed externally, so that there again we have some idea of a calibration of an internal set of movements, of an internal set of subtle non-fittings with external movement. Now we go to the Greek version of this text. We encounter very interesting terms. Arrhythmia is the word for well proportioned. or eu or you in English from Arrhythmia, that's always translated as well proportioned, and we see that all the time here. Rhythmon, rhythmos, ill proportioned is arrhythmia, arrhythmon, arrhythmo. So these are all variations on rhythmos, and rhythmos, as we discussed before, is a sort of opposition to schema. Schema being external form, and rhythmos an internal form. Maybe even as what you hear in athletes, that when they say I'm in good form today, I'm in great shape or in great form, is an internal notion of form, and it's really about that sort of a rhythmic idea of potential movements. So how does that directly relate to proportioning? Does a word like rhythmos, how did it come about that these words are related in our languages to purely temporal rhythms, as you can see on the left, coming out of the habit, where you get a very regular rhythm. How did that? So actually, before, let's say 400 BC, it was very clear that rhythmon or rhythmos directly refer to form, and it's only later that it slowly started to be incorporated in music and in the understanding of how a form moves over time and how it articulates itself over time. So we get these very subtle terms now that relate on the one hand to form, which is pure schema, and on the other hand directly related to our notion of rhythm, which relates to motion, right? So we have form and movement, form and motion, and we got this sort of in-between world of rhythmos and arrhythmia and posture and action that all relate to a form of a very subtle unfittedness. So though the discussion is about how things are fitting well and how they might fit well for an ill-proportioned body, these are not fixed elements or fixed proportions, but they need to be expressed by movement, and that movement can only be expressed if there's if the thorax gives way, so to speak, if the thorax actually makes way or steps aside in the terms of Michel Serres, and we've referred earlier in the introductory talk to somebody called Eugen Peterson, who wrote a beautiful text in the 1930s, Rhythmus, German, and it's a very strong text. In the introduction, I refer the exact same slide on the left with what Roland Barthes is saying about schema, and what his interest in the figure is. So what was interesting is that there at that point was that Roland Barthes said, okay, the figure is not schema, it's not actual form, and we have to look at athletes and fragments to understand what figures are. So a fragment, again, the notion of the gap. And on the other hand, we had Eugen Peterson with this text saying, well, rhythm is not related from is not etymologically derived from reo, from flow, but actually from reim, which is a form of drawing, or a drawing by hand, or a trait, or a trace, or even a train or a track in German. A Zug is as well as train as drawing. And then he comes with this beautiful sentence: "Eine unbewegte Gestalt, die durch Bewegung entstand." An unmoving form, Gestalt is not really form, but it's unmoving form, created by movement. Created by movement. And of course, the whole question is, if that is the case, is that movement actually dissipated? Does it really end in repose, or is there some kind of formation, an understanding of form that still relates to movement and is actually a form of internal movement to actually create stance? That's the argument of contrapposto. Now, what this means for the notion of proportion, rhythmos or arrhythmia, is that whatever proportion is, which is an articulation of a body, it can never be understood without motion. And that goes for all proportions. If it's either a plant, referring to growth, or an animal body, or an architectural body, or any other type of form, if it is made out of parts that we now call members, because members are limbs, and it refers to Ravaison, and these members are articulated, and not just like joined to each other, but actually joined by separation. That means that they leave these gaps to move. So any proportional system has to be understood through movement. Now this is for us is very important, because this makes Vitruvius even more difficult to read. And Vitruvius far more difficult to understand than Renaissance architects wanted us to believe. Yes, there are the 6 principles, and yes, there are the 3 attributes, but the 6 principles, these do not have any clear relationship to each other, and of course over the 2,000 years of translating and reading Vitruvius and trying to understand him in architecture, many have tried to create structures between the 6 principles. What are the 6 principles? Ordinatio, dispositio, Arrhythmia, symmetria, decor, and distributio. You see them on the left, and what's already interesting is that these 6 principles have very, very different backgrounds. Some are actually Greek, untranslated Greek. Arrhythmia is from arrhythmia, symmetria is symmetria in Greek, so that's a very direct relationship, and they mean something that is very, very different than what we nowadays understand as eurythmia and symmetry. Some are translated from Greek, ordinatio from taxis, decor from prepon, and then there's a lot of these words are actually developed and tested. Not so much in architecture, but in rhetoric, and rhetoric. The structure of rhetoric, especially as developed by Cicero, Cicero actually in classical Latin, has a very similar structure of 6 principles and 3 attributes. So we have the 6 principles here, the 3 attributes very well known: firmitas, strength, utilitas, usage or use, and venustas. Now venustas actually doesn't mean beauty, it means grace. There's 2 translations, Latin translations of charis, the Greek word for grace. One is gratia, the other is venustas. You see there in the red, Arrhythmia est venusta species. Anyway, the venusta there is already a notion of grace. So generally, it's understood that eurythmia is directly leading to grace. I don't think that's the case, But we do have to understand here that I think all we have to do is understand Vitruvius through the eyes of Peterson, and that's really about understanding the notion of proportion as something created by movement, and of course that's already in specific words: ordinatore, ordinatio, dispositio. Arrhythmia, symmetria. Symmetria doesn't mean symmetry at all. It really means harmony of parts. It's something we encountered in a discussion of polykleitos, and the structure of the chiastic structure of the contrapposto. It basically means that the parts or the members are interrelated with each other. You can just move one part without another responding. That's what symmetria means. It doesn't mean symmetry axis. So. This idea of arrhythmia, which is often translated as proportion, is beautiful. Arrhythmia is as Venusta is. It doesn't just mean proportion is beautiful. It means that you have to understand Vitruvius in another type of space through Peterson. So where is the movement? Where's the movement? We're not talking about moving animals here. We're talking about buildings. And obviously, Vitruvius from the 1st century BC, there's not many examples. We hardly know of anything built by Vitruvius. Of course, we know of buildings built by architects from the same period. But these... we don't have drawings of them, a few diagrams, but what this means is that, yes, we're looking at the buildings and we can measure them and interrelate the parts and call these proportions, but that doesn't mean that you understand the movement of these elements during the phase before the thing was built. And that's, of course, the design phase. We don't have any sketches. Now, what you have to understand is that, yes, there are architectural elements like columns and friezes and pedestals and capitals and domes and all these sort of members. But the members relate to each other. And while they relate to each other in space, they change internally proportions. So put columns closer together, they get more narrow. Put them further apart, they widen. And they all do this according to their own limits. So the pedestals would change their moldings. The shaft of the column would change its entices and its proportions. And of course the capital at the top would change as well. This is very important to understand, is that there's this realm of movement, both internally to each element and the spaces between these elements. So if we're looking at a building and we're actually trying to understand what architects in the 1st century BC trying to follow Vitruvian rules, they would be constantly testing sizes of rooms, relationship of walls to columns, of one wall to another, of a column loosening itself from a wall and maybe staying squared in section instead of becoming round and more independent, or actually a column moving back into the wall and becoming a pilaster, or maybe even a twisting column, or all types of columns. And how these would relate to the walls, you'd have to understand this as a completely flexible system with internal thresholds. With internal thresholds. So there is a proportional system, but this is a system that's elastic, very much like the contrapposto, almost like they're connected by virtual ropes or elastic bands, and internally also being elastic and testing their gaps and seeing where limits are and seeing where thresholds are, and actually trying to sort of settle by a notion that's quite unsettling, right, in that sense. So where the movement is, and so it's not a what Heidegger would call a pure thesis, right? Heidegger always talks about thesis as a pure positing and a pure placing and a pure putting, but it's actually far more like poetry, where you have arches and thesis, a rhythm, an internal rhythm of elements that relate to each other and check each other. So that I'd say that to look at Vitruvius from that point of view, yes, you have to understand proportion, but you can only understand proportion or the articulation of parts or members through their moving. And I'd say that's the first thing. And then this whole thing is almost like a game, because it has internal rules. And I have to be careful with this word, because of course game in our case refers to game board and football pitch and all these sort of abstract field or food spaces of rhythm that are created, subdivided by these linear systems of rules. So there's next to movement, I'd say there's a whole rule system, a game-like set of rules, and I think the third aspect would be calculation, because these rules are not open to interpretation. There's no text, so in that sense we really move away from rhetoric. There's no sense of meaning. There's really this constant calculation and checking of numbers. You can also imagine you're doing this sort of on your computer screen with numbers. You would see the numbers constantly changing, a constant weighing of elements in different sizes and measure. So it's not this universal gap. It's a gap at many different positions between many different elements, but also internally to elements. Elements are always broken up. I would almost like think of the broken column of Frida Kahlo and the snake I showed when we talked about the nave, the Gothic nave, which is another interesting element, because basically what I'm doing here is almost like giving a Gothic interpretation of classical architecture, testing the limits and testing the amount of bending. Of course, in Gothic architecture, those curved shots, so to speak, of Lionel Messi remain much more visible. Right, the bending of the ribs, the interweaving of the ribs, the fanning out of columns, the interlacing that you see in tracery relating to trade and the notion of rhythmos in Eugen Peterson. But there's this invisible curves, and it's very difficult to understand how you would have to look at the plan of a Roman temple or a Roman house. And you think you see spaces, but those spaces are perforated by many different gaps. And I'd almost would try to map them out, and it would be so interesting to see where the gaps are, where the thresholds are, and how to make these visible. But there's a lot of this is invisible in classical architecture. So movement, rules, and calculation. Now I've been looking for a few examples, and I think this would be quite a marvelous one. This is the very famous facade of the Louvre, designed by Claude Perrault in the 1660s. And just to look at this is quite a start. So if we try to bring in Eugen Peterson and try to imagine how the design process would work. So you start with elements. You start with elements, and in this case you would start with single columns. You would measure the single columns, right? So you would find a moment where the internal proportions of the column do not fit with the external proportion of the interval between the columns. And what happens is You go too wide and the column breaks. Not like Frida Kahlo's column, but it splits in two. It splits in two. And that's such an incredible invention. There are many more examples of twin, we call them twinned columns. But this is how you have to understand it. So we're in this design space, and we work with single columns because double columns do not exist as elements. That's why Quatormaire was totally against the use of the double column in architecture, because it's not a pure idea of what an element is. So instead of, let's say, a Gothic bending or a recompounding of the column, you would see something else in classical architecture. You would actually see that change of proportion becoming too fat to actually relate to the in-between space and then break into two. So the space between the double columns has to be understood as an internal gap, and the space between the double columns as an external gap. But these are immediately related to each other, right? So you get a single one and they break in two. And it's just a marvelous invention, and it's really clear that with a single column, Perrault couldn't make it fit. So this is all space. There's a loggia, there's a facade, all these elements are there. But if you would actually map this as a strategy of gaps, it becomes a much more complicated game. So this is one understanding of Vitruvius. Of reintroducing the notion of movement, relating that to proportion. Now, of course, there's a lot of this in Vitruvius, and we know he's a military architect, so he knows his machinery too. And of course, of the 10 books of architecture, the last 2 or 3 are about machines, sundials, but also the famous catapult, the Scorpio, and of course these are all made by moving parts. So I think in the universe of Vitruvius, the understanding of the calculation of elements and their sizes in relationship to movement and their internal proportions are directly related. So it's not like, okay, he's a military architect and he had to build aqueducts and he had to build sundials and he had to build, like in one job he had to do catapults and then in another job temples, and it's just like a variation of what we now call specialisms, which weren't like properly articulated in the profession yet. No, it's a much broader game. It's a much broader game that dealt with as much movement as with repose, and with the repose in proportion being directly related to the proportional systems of the elements of the machines that move. So it's a very machine-like understanding, not just of form, but really of the design process itself. Right, so the actual checking and calibrating of openings and gaps to actually create an object. So I think that's Arrhythmia. Or Arrhythmia, or what we call Arrhythmia. So this is quite different than the famous opening of the third book of the 10 books, where we get all the proportions of a man. Which of course led to Leonardo's drawing of the proportional man. There's a whole bunch of different diagrams of the Vitruvian man, but they all stand, and that's quite a mistake, because in book 3 it's quite clear that this man, and this Vitruvian man with all these proportions all the way to the fingers, is lying flat on the ground. Is lying on his back, says Vitruvius. So that's a deliberate understanding of proportion as something that is deprived of movement. It's a dead body. And its symmetry is immediately a formal symmetry at that point. Of course, that in the Renaissance it was drawn as a formal symmetry. But in the sense of symmetria, it's something completely different. Yes, it's an organizational system that is symmetrical, with left legs and right legs and left foot and right foot. But that doesn't have to lead to a physical, formal symmetry. So that's, of course, my argument of a cathedral like Chartres, that it's not just like an accident that we got one spire that's taller than the other spire, but that's actually that asymmetry is one that is of form, still relates to an organizational symmetry. So these are, for architects, very difficult to understand, but for a sculptor, understanding what contrapposto is that yes, you have a symmetrical body, but it can be in an asymmetrical pose, in equipose. So that's the argument of a Vitruvian understanding of what articulation is. I've used the galloping horse from Etienne Jules Marais from the 19th century to sort of articulate what's happening here, because for me the colonnade of Perrault is really a form of galloping. A four-beat rhythm. It's interesting for us because until now we've only looked at a horse as a standing figure, and now it's suddenly running and jumping. Because if you look carefully, you see from the third to the fourth image from Marais, you see actually that it's lifting all its feet in the air. So galloping is a form of jumping. Of course, walking is a smaller form of jumping, and trot and canter. These are all like very different rhythms. So we have this proportional body of a horse with this enormous torso and neck and head, and with these beautiful legs that become so abstract and really touch foot space only with like the most abstract surface of their hooves. So you get this very rhythmic, percussive form of walking. It's very dependent on speed, right? So walking is 4-beat, then we get trot, which is again 2-beat, which is the two diagonals, right? The front and the hind leg are sort of X-shaped, moving, alternating in a 2-beat system. And then there's the canter, which is often called a 3-beat system. And then there's the gallop, which again is called a 4-beat. Tuck it up. It's a 4-beat, that's correct, but it's much better understood as a split 2-beat. Of course, the space between the double beats is larger than between those double beats themselves, and that's how I get to the ABA system of Perrault's facade. So I'm looking at sound, and we're understanding the gap as a high speed distribution of the articulated body through a rhythm over that field, over that very abstract field of the steppe or the grassland. Or in this case, the racetrack. It's a very interesting idea that we're still talking about play and sports here, and this idea of percussion and the not seeing of sound. And I'm also wondering, so the horse never sees his feet, right? It can never really look at its feet. So it's walking and it's hearing and it's maneuvering, but it is really a sound, and it's not a visual component. And so this abstraction of rhythm is really an overwhelming of sound over vision, and this is really, this brings me also to Henri Lefebvre's idea of a rhythm analysis. I have the book here. It's really beautiful. It's very thin, where he constantly talks about the murmurs and the sound. He has his balcony to the street in Paris. He has it open, and he gets the sounds from the street, and he gets this idea of almost a tape or a code of different rhythms, of pedestrians, of motorcycles, of cars stopping and speeding up, and all these different speeds, creating this murmur, this noise, but a very articulated noise, very precise, sets of gaps, sets of openings, as a rhythm analysis of in this case urban architecture, so that the abstract plane, or the what Vitruvius actually calls the ichnographia, and ichnos is trace or footprint, which is so interesting. Footprint makes me think of poetic feet and prosody as well as rhythmic systems, to understand that aspect of architecture, and especially that aspect of Vitruvian understanding of architecture as something that is highly abstract, a form of sound becoming materialized. So let's try to make this more clear. So we have in the Grace machine, we have this plane field, this plane, and it's not a plane of immanence. It's really just like one pole of the machine, and then there's this object. Now between these, the figure has to be made through the jump. Right, so we get this internal rhythm. This internal rhythm is projected on that playing field, and what has to happen is that object needs to be broken up. It needs to be articulated, and what this field does is clearly opening up, but it is an opening up that is generalized. So there's an internal opening up of form, of schema. And then there's a generalized opening up of the field that needs to be brought together. These two have to be brought together in the figure. And I think that's exactly what's happening. This calibration of internal openings, internal movement, right? By breaking up and articulating, making movement possible. Now let's look at terms. What's a very good term for this as an alternative for a space, but it's more a notion of the gap in space, right? So we can find the gap in time. It would be opportunity, or kairos. We can find the gap in the universe, so it's chaos. But a very specific term for the understanding of the gap in space would be room, and it's a beautiful term because it has many connotations. Some of which are naval, and others are more like agricultural in the sense of an open field. It's called ro or roi, rue, open space, plain field, open country. So it's an openness. But on the other hand, it's also, especially in the Germanic languages, that's Raum, in Dutch Ruim, the hold of a ship, or nave. That's quite beautiful. We discussed the Gothic as a ship. So that's the internal. It is this internal understanding of the gap as a hold of a ship. And an external one that relates very much to the openness of the field, of the sometimes I call it the game board or the pitch, or but this is a very abstract notion of a field. So there we are, room, and I guess that in that sense that would be the first set of meanings. I think the second set of meanings is really Raum. We know that much better from the Germanic languages. It's not just room or Raum, but Weltraum, Luftraum, but it also Spielraum. And that's another very, in English, also a very precise notion of room in the sense of tolerance, or wiggle room, or slack, or it's even called play at a certain point, or clearance. That there is, and it is often very small, but it is this notion of playing room. So this is a room of excess, but it is a very measured excess. I just have to stress this again, because the notion of gap, especially in French philosophy around Derrida, we'll get to Derrida later, is very quickly this very extreme version of openness as an abyss, very romantic and sublime notion of opening or breaking. But this is a very I would almost say Apollonian or Apollonial form of the gap, and not so much the extreme Dionysian form of openness, which is a pure excess, which of course obsessed people like Bataille so much. But we're talking about something that is, and we will be discussing this opposition between Apollo and Dionysus more often, because I think Apollo is extremely misunderstood as somebody who's always about measure. It's actually a measuring of excess, and it's a very precise notion of excess. It can be very small, can be very large, but it's always very conditioned. And so this conditioning, though, it's not the obsession of Apollo with form. It's that of the gap and play as well. And what's so beautiful about the word spiel as an indication of play, it's related to the English spilling. So there's this idea of spilling over. It's the room of the extra. So room of play, room of movement is directly related to the room of the extra or the excess. But again, it's a measured form of excess. So the idea of the out of ek or x and in excess, as well as extra or spilling over, is a very precise idea of play. So let's look at how that relates to the idea of the gap, Spielraum, and gap, gaping, yawning, the hard G from gape and the soft G from yawn, that we know from Swedish as well, yard and garden, obviously. So we get these multiple pronunciations of this idea of the opening of the gap, gaping, that needs to be related to the idea of the Spielraum. So we're getting close to the sort of the conclusion of this part of the lecture on jumping, the first part. I'm just going to use like two slides from Derrida's text on the Paragon. He is very. I'm ambiguous about deconstruction, obviously, because often the gap is related to this crossing out. So we have the frame, the edge in this case, and the normativity of structure needs to be crossed out. That's the destruction from Heidegger, where you get both the word being, and then the big X that goes through. That's the X figure that crosses out being. So we got sort of the legibility of the word, as well as the crossing out of the word, which is really, in French, is sourature. So we see that very often in deconstruction, and of course we know it in architecture much better. So we get structure first, and then we get the crossing out of structure. But there's no collapse, of course. It's just an image of crossing out. So it's a very negative idea of presenting us with the gap. It's like, okay, there's the stances first, and then because it's groundless, it needs to be crossed out, which is not the same at all as the chiastic figure. The chiastic figure starts with the weakening and ends with the standing, while often in deconstruction you get like standing first and then saying, okay, now we have to be critical, and now we don't want to understand standing as the male or the phallic, or that what is understood through epistemology or reason, and then has to be crossed out. So it has to be destructured. Now that's only one side of Derrida's understanding of the gap. The other is really sort of taking the painting out of the frame, and then showing us the paragon. And what's really interesting in this case, it's that this is actually part of the illustration of the text. Standing figures that make ornament, and ornament is about spilling over, but it's a spilling over of a gap, not so much of a painting or a mirror. In this case, it would probably be a mirror, and I think what Derrida is doing here is because he's discussing Kant, and Kant talks about paragon, or actually parerga in the plural in the third critique, as typical, as an add-on. So we get structure first, and then we get ornament, and we get substance first, and then accident, and we get work first, and then play. And Derrida is actually suggesting the reversal, not exactly in the way as I discuss it with the contrapposto, where the play is really internal to the structure. Right? The accident makes the substance, the ornament makes the structure, but there is something that's spilling over, and that spilling over actually makes the frame. So it's not a frame first and then the spilling over. No, it's the spilling over that makes the frame. And I think here we get a deep understanding of okay, what is the productive nature of the gap? It's like the gap is capable of producing figures, right? Instead of crossing them out afterwards, making them negative figures or X figures, they're actually becoming now very positive figures. So this is a point where I want to conclude. This is an image of Dali with an empty frame, but waiting to jump. And I think we get to that in the second part of the talk. Thank you very much.